Kate.
And I'm Jen.
And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast, wherein we are currently discussing A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And this week we will be discussing chapters 13 through 15.
Yes, we will. And before we do that, we just wanted to say that we really appreciate all of you who are listening. We like you a lot. We've enjoyed talking with you. And we just thought that we would remind you, if you like the show and if you know somebody who you think will like the show, word of mouth is great for spreading our show around to other people. Additionally, if you are on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're using, maybe think about giving us stars for a rating, or if you're especially ambitious, give us a little review. What that does actually is it helps other people find us if they're looking for an All Souls podcast, if you leave us ratings and reviews. So we would appreciate it. If you like it, share the love.
The best thing about being in this community right at this moment is actually how quickly it's growing and how many people are coming to the series by virtue of the television show beginning filming and the amount of press that it's getting. And that means that there are a lot of people who are looking for like-minded individuals with whom to discuss the All Souls trilogy. And so we would like to help be there for them and help them find you, or find our friends at Damon's Discuss or at the All Souls Pod. So we are happy to be here, but we would also love your help giving a little rating and reviewing love to keep us going and to keep us in a place where people who want to talk about this trilogy can do so.
Yeah. So let's get into our chapters.
Yes, our reading this week, Jen and I were just talking about it. It is structurally the kind of reading that basically rockets us from the end of traditionally Act 1 in a 3-act structure into Act 2 and then some. Because while this reading, chapter 13 in particular, starts a little slowly and a little obliquely, by the time we hit the end of chapter 15, we have put in some serious miles in terms of moving the plot along and restructuring and reframing the central narrative conflict. So I'm going to give a really quick summary of what happens in these chapters, and then we will dive into our discussion from there. So chapter 13 is the chapter in which Matthew takes Diana to the lab. We meet Marcus for the first time, which is like a personal love and squee of mine. And then we talk a little bit about genetics, about vampire genetics, about whether vampires, witches, and demons are actually connected, whether they're different species or the same. Diana offers her blood, which Matthew at first resists, and then she contributes it with the idea that she's going to learn more about her genetic heritage through the giving of blood. He decides after that that he is going to be a little reckless himself and invite her over to dinner at his place. In chapter 14, we have dinner at Matthew's, and this is one of those like especially swoony chapters that does a great deal to move the romance along. And this is the point at which I think the romance moves from Act 1 to Act 2, so the romance is already solidly in Act 2 by the time we get into chapter 15 in the library. In chapter 14, we learn about all the places that Matthew has been to school. We have some steamy, we have some oysters, we have some very old wine, we have a lot of conversation about life, the universe, and everything, and then we move into chapter 15 as Diana tells Matthew that she plans to recall Ashmole 782. In chapter 15, things start out simply enough, and you think, oh, this is just another day at the library, until Diana goes to call Ashmole 782, and lo and behold, it turns out to be missing from the library. She goes into panic mode, Peter Knox threatens her, everything begins spinning, and Matthew essentially like rushes her back to her rooms. And at that point, she finds that there is a manila envelope waiting for her. When she opens it, it is a photograph of, or a series of photographs of her parents on the day that they died with the word remember. So it's very clearly a threat about keeping secrets from other witches, and she has a terrible panic attack. Matthew rushes her into her rooms, begins trying to take care of her, prevents her from fleeing, which she wants to do, and then offers her a sedative so that she can sleep. And during that time, she realizes that she is very much connected to Matthew, and she describes the tight chain that was bound up inside her, reaching out, touching Matthew, and becoming whole again. So that is basically the movement of our chapters. What are your thoughts on the structure and pacing of chapters 13 through 15?
So 13 and a good portion of 14 for me are a little bit dull. I'm not a huge fan of chapter 13, except for Marcus. And I like a good amount of 14, but I just think it takes forever. I think it takes an unreasonable amount of time in those 2 chapters to get to where we're going. And then by the time I really enjoyed the second half of 15, once we finally get going in 15, I like a lot of that a great deal. But you're right, like the pace once we get to 15 just like flies through, and it's a really long chapter. So they're very unbalanced, I think, between these 3. So, and the act break between 1 and 2 is like in the middle of chapter 15. Which is weird as well.
Absolutely. And it's something that I've noticed as I've revisited this trilogy of books several times, is that there are things that Deb does in terms of trying to tell you when time is passing and when it is not, and her sense of like elide, or when you just sort of allow the events of a paragraph to be spread out over a certain amount of time where you get the sense that time is passing. It is not her strongest skill. So especially when we get later in the series, she asserts that things happen at a certain time or on a certain day, and it's like you are fitting more things in a day than are actually possible for any human to accomplish, or you're talking about things like they've been weeks when it's only been a matter of hours. And I don't know whether that has to do in this book with the sense that like Matthew and Diana's relationship is sort of doing this like sort of seesaw thing in time, where there are moments of it where it feels like it's been much longer, and there are moments in which it's happening very quickly. And when you realize that this entire book takes place over about 6 weeks, we just got done with the real-time reading, so I am very intimately familiar with the pacing of this book in quote-unquote real time. And the amount of crud that just like happens in those 6 weeks, and what we choose to talk about and what we don't, are very, very interesting, but also not entirely believable. It seems in some senses like she plotted out the larger bones of the storyline to occur with events happening on certain dates, and that's fine, except for the extent to which that means that there are parts that feel really, really rushed, and there are parts that feel like they take for flippin' ever.
I agree. I agree. And I certainly we'll be having this discussion again when we have our book wrap up for this book, and then we're going to be talking about it a whole lot when we get to the next book. So yeah, it was actually really hard for me to revisit and reread just these 3 chapters, because I started off bored, and then I was like, am I really still reading? Like,
I don't know that I get bored in chapter 13, but today, and I do mean today, as I was reading this, I was struck by an uncanny sensation as we do the interminable description of the laboratory. And then all of a sudden, I got a feeling. And do you know what feeling it was?
What was that feeling?
It was like, welcome to Jurassic Park, right? Because Matthew does this weird showman thing where he's like, welcome to the history lab. And you're like, what are you doing? I don't understand this. And I feel like the description of the laboratory is one of those things.
It goes forever.
It does, and it's one of those things where it's like I think that for a non-science person, I'm not sure whether that was meant to add a certain amount of texture in terms of, I know what science looks like. This is how science is, how this
science did.
that didn't make any sense.
Science is science.
Like, right. This is how science is scienced, right? I know things. I don't know how much of that was meant to try and add a sense of texture. I do think that, again, it's kind of a sign of insecurity, because it's Deb moving out of a world in which she's utterly familiar into something that's a bit uncomfortable for her. And so I think that those descriptions end up being a bit more labored when she's either imagining something or putting all of her imaginings in one place, as opposed to describing something that actually exists. Because when she describes the library and the Bodleian, or places that do actually exist, she manages to sort of skate over and give you these lovely impressionistic details. But in this library, this lab, I just don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you bring up, of her descriptions of like the library versus the lab, where she's like, I am now going to describe a lab. Look at all the shiny centrifuges and refrigerators. It feels very like...
Well, it's funny that we say that, keeping in mind that we still subscribe to Death of the Author, but one of the things that Deb has said about writing these books is that she does not like to invent things. If something actually exists, she would much rather use that. And I find it very interesting that that's the case when she is inventing this lab in her head, or when maybe she sat down in a lab and just cataloged all the things that she actually saw. But it's one of those senses in which it's like she's trying so hard to capture the detail that it comes across a little clunky, especially in the audiobook. In the audiobook, I'm like, why are we still talking about the lab? Looking at it on the page, it's a page and a half. Like, you can live with a page and a half. But
on my Kindle, it's like 10. So I was like, can we just like... I skimmed it quite a bit.
I think it's one of the moments that I can sort of glide over without too much. And then we get Matthew's welcome to the history lab, and I go, oh, please.
And he like opens the door. Ah!
Exactly. And that's when I expect them to start talking about dinosaurs and Amber, and they don't.
Sure. I have a question, though, for you.
Sure.
I am wondering what you think about the idea that the library and some of the other spaces feel so comfortable for us because Diana is more in her element there.
Absolutely. I think that that is certainly fair. And I wonder, thinking about my comment about Deb's comfort level with describing these things, whether some of this is also characterization, in the sense that if this is being narrated in Diana's voice, she does tend to describe in excruciating detail new environments, and she engages in particular, as we've said, in sort of like interior decorating tourism, but she tends to try and catalog and describe and sort of separate herself from things. She doesn't have terribly emotional reactions to new places the way she seems to have emotional reactions to ones she's familiar with. Like when we get to the Bishop House later in this book, a lot of the descriptions are, to me, or they feel more emotional. I'll be curious to see what you think about when we get there. But in that sense, I think that some of it, you're right, is characterization, and that Diana's not super comfortable, and she wouldn't know a centrifuge from a hole in the road if no one told her.
Right. True. And it's interesting you bring up the cataloging too, because now I'm thinking back to the library. I'm like, we don't get a lot of like cataloging of the library. It's very, very like, we don't get like this chair and this chair and this chair and this shelf and this, which is what we get basically with a lot of the other spaces that we inhabit. And I'm wondering, I will say first that a lot of the departure into describing the scenery does not work for me. But I'm wondering, if I'm looking at it, if I'm just thinking about it, what that feels like from Diana's perspective, because she is a historian and she is in some ways like she does look at things and kind of like catalog them. So I'm wondering if from that perspective maybe it works a little bit better. I still think it's too much. But I like thinking of it. It makes it easier for me to like kind of digest all of that a little bit.
Well, and I think that as we go on, there's certainly something to the fact that Diana is interpreting and analyzing things that she sees in order to try and place Matthew and later on other characters in context in terms of the objects that they own. And perhaps it is in part because Diana has made a practice of studying people in the past and looking at details of their lives in order to learn things. And she herself has kept her life very basic. You know, she does not describe having a lot of personal possessions. She doesn't even describe having any photographs. And so perhaps part of it is inhabiting space that is comfortable to and belonging to somebody else when she doesn't really have a space that she feels like she belongs in. That could be part of it.
Well, she has spaces that she is more emotionally attached to, but she doesn't really have her own place. A room of her own. Because where she's living now, this isn't even where she's from. She's not from Oxford. She's not even from England. So,
But so Diana walks into the library, and then very quickly we get the description.
The lab.
Oh, you're right. Into the lab. I'm sorry. And then we get that sort of sketch of Marcus, which is really lovely, I think, and as a way of introducing characters, like there's not a lot of prose that is wasted on Marcus until later, and waste is the wrong word, but she doesn't spend a lot of words right here. She just sort of sketches him, and I think that you know a lot about Marcus just from the way that he's described and the way that he enters this scene with sort of boundless energy and enthusiasm and a little bit less tact than perhaps he should have, although it seems like Matthew's the only one who's bothered here.
Right. Yeah. I like Marcus a lot. And I know you want to squee about Marcus just a little bit.
So I think that one of the things that I think is interesting about Marcus, in contrast to a lot of the other vampiric characters, is that we do not introduce him with any elements of violence or danger or threat or suppressed rage or dominance. He just sort of pops on scene like some kind of loose electron, and he doesn't present as a threat. And so it sort of adds a little bit more of a nuance to the idea of vampires as a species for me, because even Miriam, who is still different from Matthew, carries sort of like barely suppressed contempt for humanity and a little bit of sort of like a I'm small but dangerous sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Marcus reads to me very much like he's like the loping, like very large dog, like puppy of the lab, and he just like comes running up and he's like, hey, how's it going, what's up?
And you know, one of the things that I perhaps like about it that we can talk about later on as the various vampires in Matthew's life are explained is coming back to the idea of family and found family, and the family you make versus the family you choose versus the family you're born into as a component of this series. One of the ways that you sort of look at people is by the people that they choose. And I think it's interesting that Matthew has chosen Marcus to be a part of his life and what it tells us about Matthew and what Matthew values. And Matthew appears to, in these chapters, for the first time display some joy, but I think that some of that joy is also reflected in the boundless energy and enthusiasm and joie de vivre of Marcus, who just seems, from the first minute, irrepressible.
Yeah. I like him a lot. Yay.
I like him, and I like his capacity for continued improvement and maturity. Like, he's a character that I think is worth the time we spend growing and building him, and he is worthwhile. Like, he's a worthwhile character and family member, and he, to me, feels developed, nicely developed, almost from the moment he walks in.
And you never really feel like he shouldn't be there. You're not like, why are we talking about this guy? Like, why is Marcus here?
Absolutely. And we can talk about what role we think Marcus plays in this story later on when we learn a little bit more about who Marcus is and what he does, but we'll table that discussion for later. I am curious what you think about the part of this chapter where Matthew insists on showing Diana all of the news clippings about vampire killings. And overall, the complicated relationship in these 3 chapters between the vampire trope, vampire violence, what vampires eat and what vampires do, and Diana's sort of attitude towards their capacity for violence.
Right. So this whole chapter is a little weird for me. Like, it presents itself very oddly. All of the conversations are they don't feel very natural to me, and I'm not sure what part of that is purposeful, and I'm not sure what part of that just happens to be that way. This chapter in particular is very awkward. And they like come in, they talk about the adrenaline, which we talked a little bit about last time already, so I'm not going to talk about that again. But the only important thing that we get out of this is the idea of vampires dying out and that other species are potentially in decline as well. We've already mentioned the vampire killings a few times by now in the book, so I'm not sure that it's worth the time that we spend on it right now, apart from the idea about like creatures dying out and like this is what Matthew's been researching, etc. That's important. Yeah.
Right. And I think that this is the first time that we maybe get some idea of how we will begin to frame and shape Diana's power and potential going forward. And I think that the building of this chapter, I'll have to think about it a little bit more, but I think that there's more going on for the larger who is Diana and what does she represent story than I have previously given this chapter credit for. Although I'll admit it's expository and kind of clunky, and it's certainly not my favorite.
I like that they're talking about the genetics of creatures. Like, I think That part is interesting. And the discussion of, you know, the witch blood and the various witches and all of that, I find to be interesting. It's just presented oddly. I don't know. The one note I will pull out, which probably also drove our scientists in the audience nuts. So hi, all of our scientists. Having water in the specimen fridge is a big no-no. But I kind of giggled at it because I was like, well, the specimens are blood. Vampires eat blood or drink blood. Water is a drink. Like, perhaps they didn't even think about it. And they're like, of course this goes in here with the other drinks. It is a big no-no.
Who knows? Who knows? That does seem like a scientific no-no. There is kind of like a creepy note in this chapter, though. I mean, I think that any time that we start playing with the idea of genetics and dying out and genetic material and species, we get into a really sort of questionable space where it touches on ideas of segregation and eugenics, and the idea that even Matthew brings up in this chapter of Diana basically wasting her genetic legacy by not choosing to engage with her power, which just strikes sort of an odd note with me. And again, knowing that one of the central ideas is about sameness and difference and how we process those and how we're all fundamentally more alike than we are different, etc., it still sort of goes ugh for me because I find it to be an odd way to frame it. I do like the addition of the origins and evolution and extinction of species to the supernatural trope. I do like that as an element. I think it makes it intriguing and interesting, especially the idea that is brought up in this book that maybe demons and vampires and witches and humans have something in common as well. I think that that's really powerful and really useful. But there are a couple moments in this chapter where I'm like, we are on very, very thin ice here.
Yeah, it does get a little bit mucky, I would say. So we have Diana's birthday. Hello, Diana's birthday.
We do. We have Diana's birthday in this chapter, and of course, if you followed along with us in the real-time reading, I did a post about this, but the significance of August 13th and why Miriam sort of blanches at it is because that is traditionally the goddess Diana's feast day. That is the feast day of Diana Nimeralia, the Diana of the woods. And in Roman tradition, August 13th was when you went up into the holy sites and you celebrated the legacy of the goddess. I had a conversation offline with one of our listeners about talking about the goddess and the idea of goddesses in this series, and I just wanted to clarify something based on that, if that's okay. So the person pointed out that I had mentioned owls as a symbol of the goddess, and the listener came back and said, hey, I thought that owls are a symbol of the Greek goddess Athena, not of Diana, not of Artemis. And I think that part of the confusion here is that, of course, Athena is a much earlier goddess in the Greek tradition. Diana and her sort of progeny come from that tradition. And so Diana as a Roman goddess combines many elements of Artemis and Athena. So there are definitely owls and things associated with her. But more importantly, I think that the goddess as is presented in the All Souls trilogy is more of a neo-pagan triple goddess, and there is a version of the neo-pagan triple goddess that is represented by a Diana figure, essentially, and that she appears as the maiden, the mother, and the crone, the owl being a symbol of the crone and symbol of wisdom. And so when we talk about Diana's relationship with the goddess and the significance of that feast day, I think that it has more to do with the greater triple goddess, neo-pagan triple goddess, than it does with Diana, the goddess, individually, although the series does sort of conflate those and put them in the same bucket.
Yeah. We do wash back and forth with that a bit. But thank you for the clarification.
No problem. I was just thinking about it and why it would strike Miriam so, and I think it's just a sign of, so far as we know, Miriam is also very old, and maybe as a sign of the favor of the universe that she has the goddess's feast day as her birthday.
Yeah, and I don't I don't want to break out of like us trying to stay just within like the chapters that we're reading and the book that we're reading. But I don't know that we ever discuss the fact that Diana's birthday is on the feast day. Like ever. Never. Not a single time. So that thing from Miriam may be like completely baffling to people unless you actually were reading it and you're like, that's the Diana's feast day. Like, because we do not discuss it ever.
Right, which begs the question of why is it there necessarily, and I think it's there for you to be curious about it and for you to go back and be like, I wonder what the significance is of August 13th.
And maybe look it up. But it seems like we're kind of like nodding to it, but then we never talk about it again, so it's a little weird.
It is a little bit weird. There is a lot of stuff in this chapter that I find to be difficult because it's just asserted without being textually supported or without like any idea of where it comes from. Like the bit about humans and their immune systems. Huh? Like that's kind of odd. Or the there's another one here about this one with Diana. I think it's fascinating. On page 163, where she offers up her blood and they go to draw it and to analyze it, she says, my blood could tell Matthew things I didn't want to risk discovering haphazardly. I didn't want to set fire to the furniture, fly through the trees, or think a bad thought about something or someone only to have that person fall deathly ill 2 days later. Where is she getting that? Where in the world is that coming from?
Yeah, because as far as we know, until we get to chapter 14, she's not going to light fire to anything. So 15 actually. Is she just like pulling out random like witch traits that she's heard about?
So I don't know what she stands to gain from that or why we take such a contradictory approach to how she feels about her magic in the next couple of chapters. But we do, and it's there. And then, of course, we have that sort of funny trope that's only worth noting because I feel like it's a thing in romance novels, fantasy novels, and particularly in sort of the young adult genre, which is like the errant piece of hair that the hero tucks behind the heroine's ear. That just shows up in a lot of romance stories, and I kind of want to know why it's so persistent.
Hair clips, ladies.
Right. Why do you think that particular trope is so persistent?
Probably because it's adorable. Like you read it and you're like, hee.
Really?
Well, I do. Obviously, some people don't.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that I don't, but I guess I wonder why it is so universal.
I think it's because they're touching your face. Like the face is very like personal and intimate, you know? And they're like touching like the side of your face. They're daring to touch your face.
Or maybe it's just sort of the casual intimacy of the gesture, where it's the kind of thing that you certainly don't do for strangers, and you certainly don't do to, well, I probably wouldn't do it to most of my friends.
Unless they were like very askew, and I'd be like, we need to fix you like for a minute. But that's not the same tone.
True. There is a phrase in my profession for that, which is just permission to fix. And then that's usually sort of implied because we all have to look a certain way and have our hair done a certain way. And so if somebody says permission to fix, I freeze because that usually means that something is wrong with me. And I'm like, do it. Whatever it is, like, figure it out. Don't let me walk around looking jacked up, please. So I just think it's sort of funny that all the romances have, and then he brushed the hair back off my face.
Right, and like why? Well, that goes along also with the heroines all having like tousled and unruly hair, which I appreciate because my hair is also unruly. However, like, why is one piece of your hair shorter than the rest of your hair? Is your hairdresser not very good? Does your hair not grow in one spot? Why does the one piece of hair always escape?
Look, I would like to add a little bit of extra textuality to this in that I saw a card the other day in a bookstore. I did end up purchasing it, dear listeners, that said, I am on my cut my own bangs glass of wine. So I like to insert that whenever somebody has a wonky haircut in fiction, is that they've cut their own bangs, and that's why it's always falling haphazardly across the face.
But then they seem to be like surprised by it. They're like, why is this hair falling in my face? This never happens. I don't know. I think it's funny. It does give me a little like woo-woo moment though.
A little frisson. It's It's definitely one of those things that people do between sort of romantic characters to indicate, like, hey, they're gonna bang later. That's just kind of...
They're getting... touched.
Yeah, it's kind of like a book. It's a book romance pattern. Speaking of which, let's have dinner at Matthew's.
I have a question. Am I the only one who finds the blood drawing scene weird?
Probably not, but I'm curious.
Like, it does not work for me at all. Like, I'm fine with her volunteering to, like, maybe they've given her a sufficient explanation. She's like, oh, well, like, take some of my blood. That's fine. I don't think we need to spend the amount of time on it that we spend. And I'm not sure that it's worth having, like, the weirdness between, like, Marcus and Matthew, because, yeah, it just doesn't work for me at all.
I don't know that it necessarily works for me either, but here's what I think that it's trying to do. It is trying, before we get to chapter 14, it is trying to show you that even when Diana's blood is out on the buffet, Matthew is capable of resisting it, that he is capable of being sophisticated and restrained and civilized enough not to give in to this instinct. It's just one more sort of like nail to put in the coffin, so that when we have this intimate interaction between them in the next chapter where he's right next to her neck, that is not a threat to the reader. Diana certainly talks about it, but it's actually not a thing that you as the reader worry about.
That part of it works for me. The rest of it, first of all, I think it takes way too long. So that part doesn't work. And the weirdness between Marcus and Matthew doesn't work for me either. Like, I appreciate the whole, like, safety thing. Like, Diana's safe with Matthew. He's drawing her blood. Like, that's all great. But, like, and I was a phlebotomist for 6 years, dear listeners. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, I don't need the play-by-play. Like, it could have been done. I feel like it could have been done much more cleanly than it was done. And that might be part of why it just, like, it bothers me. It doesn't sit well with me.
So what is interesting here, I think, and this is something we'll have to talk about in much, much later books, but the distinction between what Marcus realizes that Matthew is going through and what Matthew later realizes that Marcus is going through in another place and time, and the distinction between the understanding of the biological, the physical, the emotional thing about vampires mating, essentially, and how fraught it is. So it doesn't especially work for me. I think that Matthew's being kind of obnoxious, but at the same time, I can kind of understand where that emotional current is coming from. Well, for a chapter that we don't especially like, we spent a long time talking about it. So let's
we did. But we talked about a lot of other stuff.
That's true. But can we have dinner at Matthew's now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk to you about there is a thing that bothers me in this chapter, and I'm just going to get it right off my chest. I'm not real into Matthew as Pygmalion, the sort of, to her Eliza Doolittle, sort of like, lesson 1 in how to eat oysters and drink wine. That actually doesn't work for me. I think that there are people for whom that romantic trope of, like, show me the wild and wide world of oysters, dear romantic lead person.
And food pairings.
Right. I think that there are people for whom that works. For me, it doesn't work. But
mostly the oysters don't work for me. And this is, of course, after the 15 pages of the wine cellar that we have. Is that her statement is, it feels like I have the whole ocean in my mouth. And my literal note is, why would you want the ocean in your mouth?
As someone who loves oysters, I can tell you that is almost precisely what it's like, and I'm totally fine with it.
I do not like oysters, but I live next to the ocean, and I have tasted it, and that's not a thing that I would like in my mouth.
Right.
Where she's like, it's the whole ocean, and I'm like, I'm dying.
I'm not really sure how oysters fit into the culinary schema of Matthew, really, when he doesn't like cooked meat and he doesn't like all these things that are strongly flavored. Right. But oysters...
So does, like, oysters don't count as meat?
Well, they're basically like beautiful sea boogers. But I don't get how the oysters fit into Matthew's schema, because they're basically delicious briny sea boogers, and that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that either texturally or otherwise he would be interested in. But then again, I don't date a vampire, so I don't know.
Not something I'm texturally interested in either. So yeah, I don't, it just it doesn't work for me as a romantic trope. Let's just say that.
Oh, go ahead. Why do you think it matters that he's at All Souls?
Because it's like the most prestigious college at Oxford. So it's like very impressive, I guess. We're trying, I think what we're supposed to be reading out of it is trying to be conveyed to us that we should be very, very impressed. We ought to be impressed. I am impressed. The most impressed. Also, it's named All Souls, so...
Do you find that I mean, I take from your reaction that doesn't necessarily work for you? The thing that I do sort of like about the listing of Matthew's colleges is the callback to the prior discussion about how he's sort of for all time, and the idea that for some reason in a vampire's long life, they could choose to be anywhere, do anything. For some reason, he keeps coming back to Oxford, and I wonder sort of what that is and why that is.
I think, as we were talking about last time, with the elements of his life that, you know, of his original time that no longer exist or have no meaning, and I feel like him returning to Oxford over and over again is something that is a place that continues to exist in much the state that it was when he first encountered it. And so I feel like maybe it is a way for him to exist in time and place without feeling like he's outside of time as much.
I think that's fair, and it's almost what I was going to say, just in terms of Oxford being the kind of place that observes these very unique and very sort of bizarre traditions, and has done so for centuries. You know, they still have High Table, they still have many of the relics of prior ages on display. And furthermore, it's a place where, as we learn later, many people that Matthew really cared about were educated there. And that is a place for him where I think a lot of different threads of his life come together. And perhaps that's why it's so special and why he keeps coming back.
Right. Now, I will say, I do think that him being a fellow at All Souls is lovely. I just don't think we need to spend the amount of time on it that we do.
Right. And that is perhaps, I think, our summary for the pacing on this chapter, is that we would have done some editing.
Yes. Pick up the wine. Get in the rooms. Pick up the wine. Eat the food.
I'm not saying that we have to have sort of like I'm not saying that this has to be like super fast, like a quickie. I am saying that there are parts of this that I'm like, why are we doing this now? Why now? So I think that we could move quite comfortably.
Yeah. Although I did try really hard to be objective about it and just say, like, oh, it's nice because Matthew's really at ease and we're seeing him like enjoy himself and be at ease and be comfortable. So that I appreciate about it, and this kind of like date-like atmosphere that we're trying to create, this moment in time. It just takes a little too long.
Yes, and what I do like in particular about this chapter is the amount of time that we spend exploring Matthew's joy and Matthew's comfort for the first time, discussing himself as he is and who he's been with Diana in a way that he hasn't done with Hamish, but presumably did do with Hamish at some point. He just doesn't do it because the chapter we get with Hamish is very much focused on the here and now, except for the bit about Eleanor and Cecilia. But in this moment, he is sort of inhabiting all of his lives at the same time with Diana in a way that's really lovely, and doing so with a good deal, as I said, of joy, which is a nice thing to get from Matthew after all of the brooding.
Right. Yeah. So that I definitely do appreciate it. I do have one other little note in here before we get into the actual like important things in this chapter, which is that I think Diana's birthday wine sounds disgusting. It starts off saying that it smells like floor polish, and I'm like, As far as wine descriptions go, that does not work for me. We have a lot of wine descriptions in this chapter. That is the least successful one for me.
Right. I mean, I have certainly... I'm not even going to... Never mind.
I don't know. Well, it's kind of... And this thing is that I'm like, okay, so her birthday smells and tastes like floor polish? Like, what am I supposed to infer from that?
It is a fairly common descriptor for older wines that have kind of... And what I think they're referring to...
Like, they're maybe going for the lemon and the tartness, maybe. I don't.
But I think that smell refers to sort of the chemically nose of certain wines that sort of gets up in here the same way that floor polish does. And so I think that's the note that it's trying to hit. But I agree, it's not the most appetizing thing. And as a birthday wine, it's I think a taste for connoisseurs, not necessarily for most people. Can we talk about sex and lust and power and need and fear and all the things that happen when our hero and heroine...
When Diana's an idiot.
Right. Well, yes. So when Diana is obtuse for the last time and then sort of he just can't help himself.
Yeah. When I'm here, literally, last time I was like flapping and saying "Danger, Will Robinson." This time I literally like bang my book like on the. What are you doing? So, what do you think I would taste like? Really?
It's like it's probably in the top 10. It's certainly the most loaded question you could ask a vampire. It is also just, it's real intimate, guys. It's really intimate.
I'm like, are we? I didn't know we were there yet.
I didn't know I was reading that kind of a book. But anyways, so we have this moment where it suddenly flips from being like dreamy, dreamy wine talk to hunger and need and amorousness and fear and adrenaline. And
what do you think about this as a 3-beat? I've been thinking about this a lot. So, one that...
What do you think are the other two?
So it starts with, and a 3-beat more in Matthew's reactions and not so much in Diana's actions, because Diana's actions are like fairly much the same throughout it. So a 3-beat that begins with her saying like, well, what is your drink? Way back when we were, feels like ages ago, when we were in the caf. What is your drink? And Matthew's like, really? And then the second time she's like, oh, what do I smell like? And he's like, okay, like, I'm just gonna roll with this and be a little like condescend, but not in the negative way, but in, you know, the way that we've previously talked about of, you know, coming down to someone's level. I'm gonna meet you down at your level. I'm gonna explain.
I'm gonna meet you where you are.
I'm going to persevere and just like take this on. And then this time she's like, so what do you think I would taste like? And this time he's like, okay, look, that is dangerous. I am tired of your shit.
Nevertheless, she persisted.
Yes. And he's like, look, this is not a thing that you can just go and say to anyone, and I am going to teach you a lesson, as it were, right here and right now.
Yeah. What I think is happening here, because there are things about this that I don't especially like. I am certainly not the kind of person who is titillated by the idea of fear and arousal being next to each other, and of the potential for Matthew to overpower Diana. What I think that this is doing thematically is, I think it ties to a point much later in the book where they talk about what happens when vampires mate, essentially, and that all of the fear and adrenaline should be telling Matthew as species instinct to do the thing he's most afraid of doing, but that's not actually what he does. What he does is he kisses her. And then we move into sort of happily consensual territory and everything's going fine. Why are you laughing at me?
No, you're right. Yes. Do go on.
That still doesn't excuse the beginning. Now, I do think that it is one of those parts of the vampire trope that if we didn't do it, I would wonder where it was or why we weren't doing it, but I still don't have to like it. Does that make sense?
Yes. I am...
How would this look to you if it didn't happen?
I think it is important that the discussion is had. I think the manner in which the discussion is had skates on very thin ice and, dips a toe into some very unsavory and unfortunate territory. It reads to me a little bit better than it might for some people, but I completely understand, and you would be totally forgiven for hating this totally. For me, it reads more as, so Matthew is furious with her. To me, it doesn't read as him taking his anger out on her, which is good. To me, it reads like, this is a dangerous situation, and I'm going to show her what could actually potentially happen if she said this to somebody else. I understand that might not work for people. That's how I read it. I'm not sure it's successful.
I'm not either, other than to say that I do think that there's a certain amount of the vampire trope that when you play with it, it is fundamentally about a sort of disempowerment fantasy. And I think that is always the language that you're going to be trading in when you play with vampire ideas, because the vampire that is always very mindful of things like boundaries and consent is not the vampire, really, because the idea of the vampire as a sort of dark and brooding, emotional, unpredictable sexual force, I think, is a thing that is the reason that vampire romance and erotica is so successful, and it's also the place that vampires have occupied psychologically in human history. In the mythology of vampires going back to the very beginning, we talk about the idea of surrender and disempowerment and being captive and being in thrall and all of those things. And so I don't know that you can do the vampire thing if you don't do this thing, but I still think that this thing doesn't sit especially well with me, and still doesn't, even though it turns out to be everybody's happy and everything's fine. And then Matthew says, I took advantage of you. I should not have done that. Now, I don't like that he doesn't actually apologize. He says I shouldn't have done that, but he doesn't actually say he's sorry for it, which does bother me.
Right. Yeah. I, see, to me, it doesn't read as him trying to disempower her at all. And it doesn't really even read to me as him trying to take it. Well, it doesn't read to me as him trying to take advantage of her. It reads to me more like him saying, I'm going to show you what would happen if you actually said that to somebody who didn't care. Which I'm not saying that is something that he should have done, because I don't think that it is. But I think it's a little bit more successful for me than other times when it has appeared in vampire fiction. Yeah. And I go back and forth with it, absolutely. So, and I completely understand that it does not work for everybody. It doesn't even really on most times work for me either, so...
No, I think you have to be very deep into the romance of the wine and the oysters and everything else to be not taken aback by how wrong this moment could go. And that's not to say that it goes entirely right. Now, I do think that we are supposed to be so deeply situated in Diana's POV, that in the next page where she's talking about feeling safe with him, we are never supposed to feel that he's an actual threat. We are supposed to feel basically like the sexual power and the thrill. We are not supposed to feel fear and revulsion, even though she does mention it once here. We're supposed to be feeling this is Matthew, he won't hurt me, he's not like other boys.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've seen, we've had the whole extended blood drawing in the previous chapter, to kind of cue us for this. I'm still not sure it entirely works. Parts of it could work. The actual physicality of it is not all that problematic for me. It's the other part that is. So.
Yeah, and I sort of wonder, and I would be curious to hear our listeners' take on this. 1, did this work for you? 2, does it bother you at all? Because it might not. It certainly didn't the first time that I read this. And 3, do you think that this is part and parcel of vampire romance, or do you think that it could be separated from vampire romance and vampires? And the counterpoint I think I would offer is that there are vampires aplenty, for instance, in Gail Carriger's fabulous and funny steampunk series, The Parasol Protectorate. And to my knowledge, most of those vampires are sort of comical, but to the extent that they drink blood, it's treated, or that they are positioned as threats to humans, even when they are romantic. When there are romantic elements to the story, it is not done in this way. It's done in sort of a much lighter way, which is weird, but also kind of charming. So I'd be curious to hear what our listeners think about that scene.
And then I like how she tries to distract him by asking him what his 5th question was, but then we turn right back around and start talking about desire again, which I think is very interesting. But it's a nice call back to our epigraph at the beginning, where he's talking about that he thinks that desire and fear are the 2 forces in the world, and that's what he wrote about for his 5th question for his All Souls entry, and her talking about the fact that magic is desire made real.
Absolutely. And the fact that the 2 of them, the idea of absence and desire, fits their relationship very, very well. Not only the absence and in terms of them being sort of fundamentally lonely in certain ways, being alone, having been essentially looking for each other for so long, and then desire that brings it all back full circle, like the desire to fill the absence, but also the desire for this particular person. And I think it's a really nice place to put this in terms of, if this is the shift into Act 2 for the romantic relationship, this is a nice way to bring it, to give it thematic weight, which I think is really nice. I'm curious about her statement about the tug of war between equal and opposing impulses, having the ring of truth, which was more than could be said of the glib love makes the world go round. Again, this is one of those places where she says it, but I'm not really sure how it lands for me, in terms of it either being a truism or whether it's just a thing that Diana says, if it's a throwaway. Did you have any thoughts on it?
It honestly didn't stand out for me, so I think I fall more on the side of it being a throwaway. Yeah.
Fair enough. Ooh! And then we have Diana's self-growth and self-improvement, where she decides not to say out loud that she thinks the Malmsey tastes like vampire blood.
Yes.
Lies. Ooh, I have a meaty thing that I might like to talk about. So when we get to the movement of the greater plot, where Matthew and Diana start talking about the book and how she met the spell's conditions, I think it's also really interesting to think of it in terms of she also meets the book's conditions. And that there's a thread running underneath all of this about the idea of worthiness and worth. And whether Diana is worthy of the magic she possesses, whether she is worthy to be of the book, to touch the book, to be with Matthew, to possess the things that she possesses. And the idea that the spell and the book have chosen her, I think, is a really powerful one for the remainder of the series.
Right. And I actually really, really like the idea of like meeting conditions rather than her casting some sort of like magical spell that she didn't realize that she was casting. Yes. And I agree with all you said.
It also has this element of making the puzzle and the story and the book bigger than Diana again, which I think is important because of what we've talked about before, that all of Diana's means of solving her problems so far have been based on, like, how do I, Diana, navigate this problem that I'm having? But the idea that Matthew raises, which is that she met the spell's conditions and met the book's conditions, and that alone is almost the most dangerous thing about it. That there's something about her that the book or the spell wants, is something that recontextualizes and broadens our understanding of what is happening between Diana and this book.
Yeah. And I like it a lot. And it's almost a throwaway. It's like done very, very neatly, I think, in the context of the book.
It's done very lightly, and I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I am curious, I think, to have a discussion with you over the course of this book about the idea of Matthew and eating and how weirdly the All Souls trilogy treats the dining habits of vampires, in terms of there is almost never a thought spared for the people who are eaten at all.
Yeah. I think it comes up once, maybe, the actual humans part. I mean, certainly we talk about it with the vampire murders and in the context of that, but we don't talk about it in the context of food.
Right, or as like this is a part of Matthew that he needs to survive. And I think that Diana, when she talks about him culling his own deer in this chapter, is being a little bit flippant about it, in terms of she is only viewing it in terms of, well, you're still eating a food source that is acceptable to me, and therefore I don't actually have to confront the fact that you and I have a fundamental conflict, which is that you have to kill to eat in a very, very real way. It's never actually discussed in the All Souls trilogy whether someone can... Well, I take that back. I think it's discussed in book 2 about being able to drink from
we get it a little in
a source.
I think we get a little like hints later in this book, maybe, when we get to France. But yeah, I think we're being led to believe, since it's never really discussed or talked about, that we don't need to worry about the humans. Like, they're not being killed on a regular by all the vampires. It's kind of how I read that. Yeah.
I mean, I just read that whole bit as like, we're just not going to worry about that too much, and the book doesn't spend time on it, and you shouldn't either. But I do think that that's rather curious that we spend so little time talking about the humans who are the actual food. And then again, I understand that that's not super romantic, and that's just not a detail one wants to get into if one wants.
Yeah. It's like discussing going to the bathroom in books. Nobody goes to the bathroom in books. Unless it's for a very specific reason. Nobody eats humans in vampire romance. In this one, anyway, because it's not sexy. Yeah. We don't really talk about brushing our teeth either, so, you know.
No, we don't. We don't. I'm satisfied that there's a scene in every romance novel that we're not seeing, which is precisely like the one in Bring It On, where the two people are like brushing their teeth in the same bathroom and sort of looking at each other awkwardly, because it's a weird thing to do. Super important, but super weird too. Shall we talk about chapter 15 and all that happens there? So how much of the plot do you think gets moved along in good old chapter 15?
Like, so much. Well, as we discussed, I mean, we end Act 1 and we begin and we get well into Act 2 in this chapter.
So for those of you who don't talk about the structure of stories too much, or even those of you that do, I figure that it's time for a brief refresher. Most stories, or many stories in the world, follow sort of a 3-act structure. And the basic idea behind that 3-act structure is that in Act 1, the conflict launches and begins to escalate. In Act 2, the conflict is engaged, and that by that I mean the protagonist turns towards the conflict and their task gets harder. And then in Act 3, the activity reaches fever pitch. The world changes because one of the characters has won. And fundamentally, the idea of having a protagonist and an antagonist is that they have two mutually exclusive goals, and the world changes because one of them won and the other one did not. That's the simplest version. And so when we talk about turning from Act 1 to Act 2, we're talking about not only Diana and her choice to be a part of the story that is happening, and to interact directly with the antagonist and antagonism of the larger plot, but then also the general idea of things get worse. And I think it's interesting that people who talk about structure in romance also talk about how the second act in the structure of a 3-act romance is the act in which the two romantic leads sort of react to their desire. They take 1 step forward, but then 2 steps back, and they enter a series of pinch points. And those pinch points are basically like crisis points, are places where things continue to get worse and where their internal and external acts of sort of commitment and or retreat are inversed, and they move backwards and forwards from one another in a way that is not satisfying, because they're not actually working together and or working towards each other in the same way before you resolve it in Act 3. And I think that we moved into Act 2 of the romance in chapter 14. I think that we don't move into the real meat of Act 2 of the romance until we are well into France. like the tension of Act 2 of the romance until we are well into France. But I definitely think that we sort of escalate the tension for Act 2 of the Diana versus the World of Creatures and Diana in the Book story very, 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 very quickly here. And then we sort of leave it alone for a little bit, which is a little bit frustrating, but I think that's what we do.
So Diana goes to the library. As we discussed last chapter, she's decided she's going to recall the book, and they kind of like hatch this like little plan to go to the library the next day and have her recall the manuscript. And of course, all of our cast of library people are there, and including Peter Knox, who is again very malevolent and threatening and gross. And he makes this comment in here. Well, first of all, he notices that Matthew and Diana are closer than they ought to be, being creatures of two different creaturehoods. And that would become important as we go along. But he also makes this comment because Matthew is trying to protect Diana from Peter Knox while they're in the library. And they're telling him to go away. And Knox is like, Diana belongs to us, not to you. And what I really wanted to have happen is for Diana to be like, actually, I don't belong to anybody. That's not what she does, but in my mind, that's my... And at the very least, Matthew isn't like, no, actually, she belongs to me. And I'm like, well, okay, so we don't have that at least happening. But
true. And Diana, as we've discussed, does suffer from some sort of weak some weak protagonist problems sometimes, where she doesn't have a ton of agency. Her goals are a little bit muddled. She has a little bit of sort of an aimless thing going on in the beginning of this book, and I think that that's partially because who she actually is so buried beneath all the layers of trauma that it's a little bit harsh to call her a weak protagonist, because in some ways I think she's a weak protagonist on purpose, because she is not fully herself yet. And so it's difficult for her to have clear goals when she doesn't even really know who she is.
And I like aimless as a description because I feel like she herself is aimless, so and wandering. So I think it's okay that she's like that, but it does irritate me a lot, especially in this part of the book where I'm just like, could you just like stick up for yourself a little bit, please? And she kind of does, but not really.
And yet, at the same time, she has been trying for so long not to garner any kind of attention, not to be remarkable. And one of the ways in which you might be perceived to be remarkable is if you are outspoken or if you stand up for yourself in certain ways, particularly if you stand up for yourself in a very public way. And I think that that is an interesting way to look at how she processes the antagonism in particular of Peter Knox, and why I think that she is more willing to push back against him in an environment where she feels comfortable, but the fact that the book didn't come back to her and the fact that Matthew and all these people are present have made a very comfortable environment very uncomfortable for her, and she retreats a little bit.
Well, they leave. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess she becomes unsure of herself. More unsure of herself than she has been previously.
Yes, and I think a lot of that is panic and fear, and one of the things that this chapter does very effectively for me is communicate Diana's flight response, her get out, get out, get out reaction, and the fact that she is so focused, and while we are embedded in her POV, it's frantic. She is desperately trying to get out and away because, again, that is one of the ways that she deals with conflict like this, is that she just evades.
Right. So we leave the library. We're not at the library for very long. We leave. We go back to Matthew's place because that's where he takes her. And he says that he's going to kill Knox, like, outright. I'm not sure that threat particularly works for me. I don't think it's very subtle. Not that Matthew is always subtle, but I'm like, it just doesn't work for me.
No, it doesn't work for me for a couple reasons. Although we are going to have to reckon with Matthew and the threat of violence over the course of this book. I think one of the reasons that it doesn't work for me is that this story doesn't work if Matthew just kills the antagonist. Like, if he just kills, like, the only antagonist we've really seen so far, then what? You know, like, they seem to behave as though getting rid of Nox or eliminating Nox is going to be the thing.
Is like the answer.
And I don't think that for all of Matthew's age and sophistication, like, that's really dumb. Although I think later in this book we also get context for that, in that we learned that Matthew is not a terribly strategic thinker when he's angry.
Sure.
He just can't do it. He absolutely...
But we're not there yet.
We're not there yet. But I think...
We don't know that about him yet.
Well, but I think that there are threads of it here. I think it's fair to say that he appears to be acting out of a destructive emotion, which is one of his weakest traits. Weakest, but I mean, like a character weakness, that he acts out of his emotions in a way that is similar to Diana, but in also some ways only more dangerous than Diana, I think, because she doesn't have her full power really yet.
They go back to Matthew's, and she is upset. We have the blue sparks again, and this whole discussion with Matthew about the blue sparks, and we get into an argument, and starting off with Diana saying, I don't get angry. And I'm like, honey, you literally just got angry. So we have some of that, like, Diana denial again going on, which makes sense given the context of, like, where we just came from.
How about the fact where she minimizes that she set a tree on fire by saying it was just a small tree?
Yes.
Because that's clearly the essential fact here, is that it's just a
and
small
also
tree.
The kitchen
Small fire,
and some
small tree.
curtains and a bunch of other stuff. In addition to the previous time when Matthew wasn't there, and now she has, blue sparks all over his rug. So I'm like, who are you trying to convince here that you don't get angry?
Why do you think we do the thing where Matthew holds on to her and keeps her from running away? Why do we do that? Okay.
I was thinking about this earlier. I think it is another... It's slightly more successful. It's an unsuccessful attempt to, like, coalesce some of the various, like, elements that are going on here. So on the one hand, we have Matthew's, like, hunter instinct, and she is upset. So she has all the adrenaline. We previously talked about all of that. He asks her not to run away because of, like, what's currently going on with his biology. On the other hand, we have Diana again wanting to just, like, pretend like nothing happened, like leave and just, like, go on with her daily life, which is not a thing that at this point in our story that is possible. So, and she starts trying to be like, oh, I'm gonna leave, like, this is ridiculous, I'm upset, I don't want to talk about it, I'm just going to walk away and pretend that none of this happened today. And he's like, no. And I'm not sure how successfully it works for me. I don't believe that she, in this case, some other cases, I have a different opinion. I don't believe in this case that she is, like, actually upset that he's trying to have a conversation with her, because I think she knows that she's being a little bit obtuse. But I can understand if people don't like this section, because he is, like, and she does make the comment where kind of flippantly, where she's like, oh, and, people holding me against my will, and, like, all of this stuff. And I'm like, well, I don't know that you're all that upset about it, so.
Yeah, and I think that the difficult part is the extent to which it is treated as a threat and the extent to which it's not. And again, I think that I'm going to say this very carefully. It's not that I don't believe that there can't be nuance in fiction. And again, not that I don't believe you can't do sort of disempowerment fantasy, etc. in fiction. I do believe that fiction cannot possibly begin to approximate the nuance of real life people. And I think that it's important in fiction to keep the lines between what is and is not a threat to your characters, particularly when it becomes a life or death or a sexual threat. I think it's very important to keep those lines clear. And if you're telling one kind of story, for instance, if you use sex as a threat against one character, then when another character does similar behavior, you can't treat it as not a threat. It has to be kind of played straight as it's either is or is not a threat in the context of this fictional world. And so I think that we have a problem, right, with Matthew being a threat but not a threat to Diana. And that is a really hard line to walk successfully. And again, I don't know how much of that is like you decide to play with a vampire toy and you're sort of stuck with that tension no matter how you slice it. For me, it would probably be more effective if he barred the door.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think there are more successful ways of doing this scene wherein Diana doesn't leave. He keeps her from leaving because they do need to have a discussion, but he doesn't like bodily restrain her. I don't think that part is necessary. I mean, we do get the sexy bit at the end, but we could have that without.
Right, and I do perhaps buy, and maybe this is where I digress, I do perhaps buy that he needs to do something physical to stop her because she's not being rational, and this is what she does. She gets in frenetic activity, and she freaking runs. Like, she literally goes. And so I think that either holding her hands, right, like just taking her by the wrists or something, or getting in front of the door, I think that those would serve the same purpose without having the sort of like creepy vice-like I'm just going to prevent you from moving at all thing.
And yeah, I agree because like she's literally lighting things on fire and now she's like, I'm just gonna go and it's fine. and you're like, you've just told us that you like practically burned down your house like 3 times when you were a kid. Like, this is not something you should be taking lightly. And I do agree he has to keep her there and, you know, like be like, look, until you can behave in a rational manner and have a discussion.
Well, I also, for plot and character reasons, I sort of wonder what this book looks like if Diana goes back to her lodgings alone and finds that manila envelope.
Yeah.
Like, I think she basically dissolves in a fit of sparks and the entirety of New College goes up in
she just
flames.
like implodes and, you know, yeah.
And I guess the thing that is really also difficult for me about this is the extent to which we present Diana as being traumatized by the feeling of being hunted and trapped, and the extent to which we play with Matthew as Hunter. I think that's the other thing that sort of niggles at me. And again, not enough to kick me out, not enough to throw me away, but I do think it is a difficult place to be. And the argument Matthew is special because he's Matthew doesn't get me all the way there.
No, it doesn't. And you can only use that so many times.
Really. I know he smells real good, but that doesn't really overcome the squeezy, stoppy bit.
Yeah. But the resolution to this particular, where she's like, you know, saying all this stuff about how he's only interested in the manuscript, like all of these things, he gets her to tell him about all of these situations that she's been in where she has, you know, produced sparks, and he's trying to kind of like logic out why she might be doing it, and she admits that it's happened like this week twice basically, and it hasn't happened for a very, very, very long time prior to that. So that is all good information to have. And then we do get a little like squee romance there at the end, which I think would be more successful without the whole like bodily holding prior to that.
Correct. The part about the romance that I do find very successful is actually once he gets her back to New College. And I do think, just as a small note, we talked about how Peter Knox was so powerful for me as a potential antagonist because he represents Diana's own institution sort of threatening her, and the idea that the photo of her parents comes through inter-university mail, that it's like completely banal, that it is the kind of thing she handles on an everyday basis, and it's basically...
Like, it's a manila envelope. It's the most banal thing you could get.
Right, and it's basically got a cobra inside of it. I think that the transition from that moment to Matthew taking good care of Diana, even though clearly this is another one of those moments where her adrenaline and her fear and her absolute dissolution in the face of the picture of her parents is the kind of moment where you would expect a vampire character to take advantage of her, and instead he takes care of her.
That's more successful.
Absolutely more successful, because it also speaks to that she is more important to him than his own instincts, and the instinct is now guiding him towards trying to keep her safe, even when he does it in sort of a boneheaded way.
And since we know he can do that because he has previously cared for her when she has had a panic attack. And then I think you're right. Like, the problem is that we keep like waffling between either it's predator prey or it's Matthew has control of himself. And like, even though she has adrenaline, it's okay. He can take care of her. And we can't quite decide which one of those we want to be.
Absolutely, that's it in one, right? While I think that the adrenaline device, for lack of a better word, is a successful way to describe the relationship between vampires and human prey, or how they view their food when it runs, or what excites them about the hunt. I get that. I think that actually works pretty well. The problem is that we keep putting Diana in situations where she is overcome with emotion, anxiety, fear, stress, all things that presumably produce either an endorphin or adrenaline response, and Matthew keeps reacting differently every single time. Now, whether that relates to things that we learn much later, or whether that just relates to sort of an inconsistency and sort of like a lumpiness in the way that this is portrayed, or how difficult it is to do the vampire thing while also doing the romance thing in a quasi-adult, not quite so dangerous and manipulative way, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, we all have to keep an eye on that. We can have a tally board, perhaps.
I do actually quite like, just as a nice note at the end of this chapter, the chain unfurling from Diana and snapping into place. I actually think that that's really nice.
And that's a nice, lovely imagery that carries us through, that stays with us as we go through the books. And I would like to say, though, that the whole thing with the picture is vile. Like, sending somebody a picture of their dead parents, like, not just like
slaughtered.
Yeah, slaughtered parents, not just like my parents died in their sleep, but like my parents were disemboweled. Here's a picture.
Oh, and by the by, I was there. You know, like that whole like thing we had with Jillian in our last episode about whether she was present, and this idea that like the community of witches, who I presumed even from my first reading was the group that was sending Diana these photos. Of course, we don't talk about that in this chapter, but that's where I accepted that the threat came from. The idea that Diana, quote unquote, belongs to them, and that they can treat her however they see fit, and that they may treat each other or
like she's a slave, essentially.
Or treat like certain other members of the species a certain way just because they don't like what they're doing, I think is really vicious and horrible.
Yeah. Yep. Does not give us, apart from Saren, and we do not have a very good view of witches so far.
Not for a long time.
In this series, yeah.
But I think that we have to do that to an extent, because we have to make it so that that's not where Diana turns, so that Diana constantly turns toward and chooses Matthew.
Right. Yeah, true. Good. And then I think we leave this chapter with Diana asleep in the bed. Yes?
We do. We leave her saying that she doesn't like the sedatives. I can completely understand why Matthew carries them, though. I do, absolutely. And I do I have a moment with Diana where I'm like, I both understand and don't understand the not wanting a sedative thing, because I would think that having that much anxiety would be absolutely exhausting, and particularly after like a really bad anxiety attack, it seems to me you would want to lie down and like not be present for a while. But who am I to say?
Yes. Yeah. So we go off to Dreamland. We get all of this information about her parents. Matthew learns about her parents, which he didn't really know before.
Which is also like, it sort of calls back to chapter 9 when Hamish is asking him whether he knew Rebecca Bishop. And he said, oh, I'd heard about them, but I didn't hear, I don't know anything. And then the idea that he doesn't know that they're dead. Like, he doesn't know that Rebecca and Stephen are dead.
I think that speaks more maybe to like the isolation of the they know of the important players in each like group, but they don't necessarily track each other unless they're in like direct conflict with them, I think. Right.
Or maybe there is something about how information is passed amongst creatures that they know who to be on the lookout for, or they are interested in one another for various and sundry reasons.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that we leave Matthew and Diana with Diana being asleep and having the chain between them.
Nice.
Yep. And that's where we leave until the next reading.
Which is 16, 17, 18. Yeah. We're going to end up in France, aren't we?
So, we are going to end up in France, and then you will have to put up with me imitating Isabeau quite a lot. In any case, if you are interested in following us on Twitter, you can find us at Chamomile Inn, as in November Clove, or you can go to our website, Chamomile and Clovecast at blogspot.com. No, not Blogspot. What am I talking about? Chamomile and Clovecast.wordpress.com. You can also look for us in iTunes, or take a look at Libsyn, where you can also subscribe to our feed.
And as some of you know, we're doing a few technical changes. It shouldn't affect you at all. If you have trouble finding us, just email us or tweet us, or one of those other things that you can get in touch, and we will let you know. We always have our direct RSS feed to the episodes on our website, always. So that is fallback for you if you ever lose track of where we are.
And you can find us on Gmail at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com. So seriously, guys, if you have any kind of technical difficulty finding us, or if one of your friends has an issue finding us after we make the move, please, please, please let us know, and we will do our very best to help you fix that problem.
And we look forward to talking to you next time when we go to France.
Ah, yes, vive la France. So we look forward to seeing you in France. Vite, vite, allez, allez.
Yes, and thank you for listening.
Bonsoir, mes petites. Au revoir.